Hello everyone. Welcome to this lecture on creative labor. This lecture is part of your paper on media, culture and society. In this lecture, we will discuss about the recent discussions on the idea of creative labor and problematize it within larger discourse on labor studies. In the recent years, there is an abundance of literature on creative labor. These studies start their premise from labor in culture industry to cultural industries, undermining labor from other sectors of production. Accordingly, scholars have identified issues and problems with the term creative labor. In this lecture, we'll attempt to provide a thumbnail sketch on the issues on labor and situate creative labor within that argument so as to know the specificity of issues related to creative labor, and also provide a distinct field of inquiry as existing issues are unresolved and creative labor bear the brunt even though the term remains much in circulation. In this lecture, you will learn the idea of creative labor within the larger discourse on labor studies. Much of the discussions on creative labor focuses on informal or organized sector where a large section of labor force are engaged. Tertiary sector being the largest employment generating sector and the largest labor intensive sector attracts more opportunities and receives primacy for the policymakers. Culture and media are part of this sector. The labor engaged in these sectors are self-employed, hence the need to study creative labor. However, questions arises to what extent the issues and problems faced by early two sectors are resolved or carried forward in the tertiary sector. How is creative labor different from labor in other sectors? Besides qualifying the term creative labor, we would also like to engage and address the implications of creative labor and challenges in Indian society and economy. Now, while dealing with the idea of labor studies and the larger debate, the contour of a debate in labor studies in India, we find that studies on labor are a well-researched area. Past research has shed much light on the notion of labor and their relations in Indian society. For instance, issues like commitment, migration, rural-urban dichotomy, attitudinal and behavioral dimension of work, class formation, unionization, factory as a system and so on. Much of this scholarship is carried out with an eye towards a cooperative and labor-managed production. It also led to a focus on collective bargaining, inter-union rivalries over jurisdiction, and intra-union battles over organizational structure, funds, and power rather than any emphasis on workplace relationships or the links between workers and their social political communities. Further line of investigation emphasized on issues that attracted attention for state legislation and regulation such as child labor, sweatshops, women's work, especially homework, industrial safety and under and unemployment. The labor policy studies reached well beyond the union organizational confines into families and communities, into the world of women's labor, or toward the experience of unemployment. The workers' world replaced the trade union as the locus for inquiry. The explosion of these concerns, a consequence of viewing labor in its full socio-economic and cultural context, fragmented the field. In fact, some of the reasons may be attributed to the decline such as in manufacturing sectors, devaluation of skills, respect for individuals, and awareness of the human costs of technological achievement. However, one needs to move beyond celebrating or defending workers and machines toward a deeper understanding of industrial and technical dynamics, its meaning for an influence on the nation, and role within global patterns of social and economic change. The expansion of tertiary sector has reflected enough on the nature of labor and the people engaged in such labor process, their work lives, and the nature of experience in the labor process. The sharp rise of such labor process within last 3 decades highlight the increase of job opportunities in different capacities, be it customer service, service providers, customer relations, and so on. These activities show the rise in recognition of management in the organization. Emphasis on management in organization ensures the quality of service, relation with customers, and image building exercise for the employees, with a special emphasis on the art of presentation of emotion as required for the organization. But the relationship between emotion and theory of organization is a troubled one. Scholars argue that emotion is pre-social, irrational, cognitive, and physiological issue. So emotion came to be perceived as a force to be excluded from the public sphere of social organizational life. Actions motivated by emotion were characterized in scientific management and human relations as irrational, unconscious, and corporeal. This simplistic and unidimensional perspective on emotion arose from a series of studies. However, recently, management practitioners and theorists have come to recognize the role of emotions and the emotional propensities as a prerequisite for a successful interaction. Consequently, recent managerial accounts of the organization lay stress on the significance of service interaction and the incorporation of human emotion into organizational life. It can be stated here that early approaches towards the managing of emotion into the organizational sphere could be conceptualized as looking for emotion into management orientations. It indicated towards the need for organizations to be subjected to emotionality. Yet, what these various managerial approaches share in common? Emotion as the antithesis of reason. While the early studies on human relations stress on informal social factor as a digression from such organizational behaviors that are considered vital by scientific management, both the approaches have a similar conception regarding the role of management vis-a-vis emotionality. Thus, management training was considered a vehicle for bearing about ways to master emotional factors that were counterproductive to the organization. The new style approaches to creative labor and human emotions, in effect, share much in common with the early supporters of human relations and their perceived concerns regarding artificial limitations between an individual and the corporation. They have argued that most notably, organizational stability may come at the price of losing those sparks of originality, flexibility, and creativity that are ignited or initiated through emotions. It calls for the identification of inventive solutions which probably could arise from processes that negotiate between varied groups, and in a more traditional approach, it is also believed to be excluded in organization that prioritizes rationality over emotion. As Feynman has put it, What early scientific approaches to management and the exclusion of irrationality from the parameters of organizational life seem to share with later approaches to the management of emotion as a human resource is a restricted, restrained, and even mechanical understanding or emotion as an attribute or an object to be manipulated and managed to be subjected to rationality. The managers seek to combine the subjective and indeed sensitive aspirations of their employees with the planned goals of the organization through ensuring that work itself is practiced as a meaningful and personally rewarding activity. It is no longer sufficient for managers to seek to secure instrumental compliance from their employees. Relatively, they must intend towards achieving cultures of experience, cultures that would make each and every individual employee of the organization feel both respected as well as personally fulfilled as part of a team. Thus, a sense of autonomy has to be combined with a team spirit based on shared goals and a commitment to organizational success. To achieve such a level of cultural homogeneity, managers would have to learn to move beyond their traditional and rationalistic concerns with the manipulation of objective factors such as production, targets, staff turnover levels, and input-output ratios, and start to take seriously the realm of subjective experience of work organization. Interestingly, words like society, family, and even familiarity have experienced shifts from the being on the edge earlier to the core of managerial discourse, in a way challenging the rationalized model of organizational life over emotionality, comprising impersonal and objectively defined relations of accountability and authority. Thus, a new pattern of organization is emerging in which, in contrast to the me culture of the past decade, a more sensitive and caring approach to the life would come to dominate. And this is what we call it, the labor of love. From the discussions earlier, as we discussed so far, what we gather is that the caring approach to labor and work highlights the pleasure which is derived by the cultural workers from their respective work, as well as the enthusiasm with which they launch themselves into their chosen careers. What we get here is that creative work basically is a clear indication of emotional labor, which is identified as a vital element of labor, supposedly in an increasingly service economy, as was identified by Hochschild. If we further elaborate, we can say that emotional labor includes deep acting, where workforces employ their sensitive and emotional lives by remaining a part of the work process. The labor or work processes indicates towards the increasing administrative control over personal and conventional non-work aspects of human lives. As opposed by Hochschild, all companies, but especially paternalistic non-unions ones, try as a matter of policy to fuse a sense of personal satisfaction with a sense of company well-being and identity. The scholar also noted that for emotional workers, emotions and feelings rule and social conversation have been removed from the private domain, making it a public one, where they are processed, standardized, and subjected to hierarchical control. Undoubtedly, creative labor has always been considered as labor of love, signifying something new. Existing literature on the topic show that majority of the people's experience of cultural production is that of inequality, self-exploitation and segregation from the social life. For instance, Gill and McRobbie have noted the exclusionary nature of network culture, where one necessarily has to be part of the club or party culture for finding work. It extends to hanging out with established contacts for networking and increasing the exchange circuit. We can observe here one striking feature about the re-emergence of ethnic and class inequalities, chiefly around issues of contact and employment practices. Yet this approach of human principle is only available and restricted to those consisting the stamina and capability to let work take over all the other areas of their lives. Unfortunately, this practice tends to exclude single or aged parents, as was observed by McRobbie. Another widespread practice is self-exploitation, and in this context, McRobbie has pointed out how in the fashion business people are more than willing to offer free labor for gaining authority and for making some networks, with the hope that such contacts might lead them to a stable and good paid assignment. Another degrading scenario of exploitation was noted by Ursel, where several graduates at the entrant label will basically work for a zero remuneration in the television or showbiz industry with the hope of finding a paid commission. Nevertheless, in spite of the difficulties of searching for a paid secured job and making a living, larger numbers of people are found to be attempting to pave their way into the cultural and creative industries, looking for independence, self-fulfillment, and also glamour. As observed by McRobbie, the particular issue of glamour as a chief motivation of creative labor has been somehow wrongly ignored, though it forms a critical legitimating purpose for the alleged value of cultural creative work. We notice here a contradictory situation, as in one hand we find several pressures of exploitation, zero or less pay, and insecurity that point towards the common practices of cultural producers. Whereas on the other, we can note these creative workers seem to be deriving a pleasure out of the efforts they put in creative labor. As noted by Don Gellert, work for these cultural creators is more of a site of autonomy and self-fulfillment. Labor markets in the post-industrialized modern economy, predominantly those in the creative industries, are viewed as those no-collar zones where no one can achieve the goals of liberation and self-satisfaction. For instance, Florida defines how the no-collar work site substitutes conventional hierarchical control systems with newer approaches to self-control and peer recognition through intrinsic forms of motivation. We can state here that the quest for independence and self-actualization is vital to the restructuring of creative labor. It may even reach that extent where autonomy and self-fulfillment may also trade for job security. Creative labor gives the scope of expressing individual identities and learning and managing skills through work. This sort of self-realization work can also be connected to the logic of individualization. As argued by healers, people have been thrown back on themselves as the crucial basis of significance. It can be elaborated through the dynamic where workers are offered the incentive of self-sufficiency as a part of the benefit package as provided by the creative job or labor. Through the works of Foucault, we can notice that the discourse of originality, entrepreneurialism, and the talent-steered economy works as a form of governmentality that regulates the biases creative workers are subjected to so that they adapt to the rigorous demands of deregulated cultural markets. Such a deregulated working domain is embraced by the creative workers as it is endorsed in social discourse to be a place for shaping an identity with the possibility of achieving a facet of stardom. What we derive here is that work in this new innovative and creative environment becomes a zone of strong personal gratification, self-organizing, and reflexive pleasure for any individual. Simultaneously, this creative environment also sometimes becomes exploitative, certainly hazardous, quite prone to ethnic, gender, and class discriminations. Though these drawbacks are discussed in a much generalized sense, yet in this context, failure is individualized. What is remarkable about the existing research on histories of creative work on cultural production is the high level of erosion experienced by cultural workers as they get older and disillusioned. This attrition was appropriately put in through a question by McRobbie that how many times can people reinvent themselves in a winner-takes-all market, risk-taking takes its toll. While writing about the new media workers during the late 1990s in New York's Silicon Valley, Ross described the impact of the industrialization of Bohemia, which has occurred since the 1960s, where entrepreneurship was supposed to be absorbing a sort of counterculture and then earning revenues out of it. He thoroughly described the rise of the human workplace, which meant work and play are interconnected, where young new media workers can wear clothes or live as they want to and are also encouraged to maintain individuality or express themselves creatively. What is interesting to note here is that though on the surface all would appear well and happy, autonomous, enjoying a room for self-expression, giving high levels of productivity, contributing to economic growth, yet despite of all these such young workers are also extremely deunionized, working for painfully long hours, mostly with no health cover and other social security aids. As was noted by Ross, here emerges the unseen power machinery of the human workplace, which means in Ross' words, to extract value from any walking moment of an employee's day. Ross further argued that it can only be attained with supposed autonomy, as no profession is able to register or implement its employees unrestricted and liberal thoughts during the service tenure. Likewise, Gill has revealed how new media work is perceived as cool, creative, and egalitarian, which means equal wealth and status for all people, hence using cultural values to endorse a kind of flexible labor bearing all associated pains to some extent as described above. It is undeniable that noteworthy hierarchies and uncertainties like gender discrimination do exist and are quite common. Here again, Gill noted that it is unexpectedly the very structures of new media labor that are considered informal and flexible, enabling the beginning of new forms of gender inequality. While discussing about problematizing creative labor, before we proceed further, we need to have a clear understanding of the idea of creativity, which is both condemned as well as considered extraordinarily fashionable. So here the question arises, why such a contradiction and paradox? In simpler words, we can derive that it is discredited, condemned, because the very concept of creativity was once regarded to be a special characteristic that was supposed to be something quite unusual and rare, confined to only a selected few or those who are God-gifted. While this notion is considered unfashionable now because overt elitism, or not covert elitism probably, has been banned in a deceptive culture of egalitarianism. It has almost become a conventional wisdom to state that every individual is creative and now no one is excluded. However, the measurement level will always be there and some would be considered more creative than others. Generally, creativity is most commonly associated with art, inspiration, and imagination. It is thought-provoking whether such generalized associations are too elitist today, and people who do not belong to the category of artists can be considered creative too, or not. Though with time, hierarchy fall and analytical distinctions are erased, yet it is very hard to analyze anything the distinction between what is and what is not creative. Considering today's scenario, it is indeed a conventional assumption that there is hardly any distinction between art and business. Further, in terms of individualization of creative labor and precisely of cultural work, it is essential to position this argument in a wider academic perspective on human labor, cultural production, and creativity. This idea applies to both everyday experiences of certain classes of work, engaging particularly the young people, and the new liberalization of the existing political economy that has made the working life unwarranted and unsecured. This can be partially camouflaged today by the rhetoric of creativity, which is connected to a discourse of empowerment in administrative discourse. Developments in the creative labor process related with cultural work may give a liberating and existentially enabling experience, yet the negative effects in terms of employment conditions and remuneration cannot be completely ignored. While concluding, we can say that in this lecture we have discussed the concept of labor and discussed various issues pertaining to labor. It also discussed issues and trends related to creative labor and interrogated the idea of creativity and its celebrations as well as its implications. Lastly, I would say that this lecture also tried to ponder upon the issues of emotion and emotionality and the role of management in the changing formations of labor process. For more details, please read the e-text of this lecture properly and attempt the questions in the end. Thank you.